Hello, good morning. I'm Carrie. I'm the founding PM of WMB, and I'm really excited to get to share this awesome webinar on Model CI with you. I'm joined today by Hoff, who's one of our fantastic sales machine learning engineers. And Hoff, I really appreciate the work you've done to build a demo for Model CI/CD today. I'm so excited to tell the story together. And I'll start out with a short overview of the product and the tools that we offer, and then I'll pass it over to Hoff to get into the live demo here today. So thank you so much, Hoff, for joining. Now I'll pull up some slides and give a high-level overview of the product and our platform. So first off, zooming out, Weights and Biases is a whole suite of tools for machine learning. And so that includes tools around models, prompts, and then our high-level platform to allow you to do things like track your models and data sets. So I'll start with models briefly. And this is something you're likely more familiar with. This is our product that we started building in 2018. So first off, you're tracking experiments. So as you train a model, tracking the progress and seeing if it's better than the previous model you trained. Then you're versioning and preparing your data. So you're looking at things like, is there a class imbalance in my data set? Or is this model struggling on a certain class or a certain type of data? Then you're collaborating. So you're identifying high-level insights in WMB and then sharing those with your team. And finally, you're having a system of record, so a central place where you can see all of the different models that you've trained in one page, and you can identify what the best model is, and then make sure that everyone's on the same page about that. This also pairs well with other tools. So a key value at WMB is being able to integrate with other systems or other tools that you're already using. So that could be, say you're using PyTorch Lightning or LangChain or another tool in the ecosystem. Our goal is to make it as seamless as possible to easily pull an integration off the shelf and track the results. We also integrate with whatever infrastructure you're using. So say you have a machine under your desk, say you have a huge cluster in the cloud in AWS or GCP or Azure or somewhere else. We'll integrate easily with all of those destinations, make it easy to track your results. So let's talk about prompts. And this is the focus of today's discussion. This is around LLMs and how to track the progress you're making there. So with prompts, we have kind of two themes. The first theme is fine-tuning. So how can you efficiently fine-tune a huge model and make it fit your specific business use case? Now, here we offer integrations with Hugging Face and PyTorch, so making it really easy to track the results of fine-tuning. And then we log back metrics and samples from training. And so Hoff will touch on this in the demo today. We also have prompt engineering tools. So if you're iterating on prompts, if you're tweaking the system prompt to try to make it generate better results for your users, we can actually track the progress of that. And we do it really easily with something like a LangChain integration, where we can even show you the stages of each step that the model takes when it takes the input and then gives you back the output. So both of these sides of both fine-tuning and prompt engineering are captured here in WMB prompts. So I'll touch on traces first. So we have this integration with OpenAI evals that allows you to see this central dashboard of the money that you're spending on using their API, the accuracy, and you can visualize these results as you iterate. And so this is an example, a screenshot from a report that was generated directly from WMB. And Hoff will actually touch on exactly how you can generate a report automatically so that each time you run a new evaluation, you could get a standardized view like this one. We also have tools for understanding and debugging chains. So looking at each of the inputs and the output that the model produced and whether or not it was a success or failure. So being able to visualize the results of evaluation for a different prompt. And then I'm diving in here to this little trace timeline. And what that allows you to do is actually drill down and see each step of the process. So what happened when, say, the OpenAI API was called, what the inputs and outputs were, or if it was using a tool like a calculator. So we capture all of that, which means it's a lot easier to debug and see, where things are going wrong in, say, your use of LangChain. Now, we also have this monitoring tool, and there are a lot of problems with monitoring LLMs in production. This is a hard, frustrating thing, and it's really hard to systematically evaluate what poor performance looks like. So to know if one model is doing worse than another model once you deploy it. It's also really expensive. Deploying these models, it requires a lot of infrastructure and also new development patterns. There's also constantly evolving foundations. So you can't just set up a model and leave it and be sure that it'll continue achieving the performance it got when it was deployed. It's also hard to capture and combine inference data. So how do we address all of these challenges? Well, with production monitoring in weights and biases, you can use this central dashboard to capture the results of how the model is performing and see a centralized dashboard with exploration in the context of the larger development that you've been doing. So you don't need to jump from tool to tool to understand how the model is performing. We also make it easy to monitor the cost of using that large language model. So how much are you paying OpenAI or Anthropic for using their API to serve predictions? It's also integrated directly with the rest of our experiment tracking tools that I just touched on. So it's a lot easier to go from one stage of your development lifecycle to another. And for production data, this is where we can capture something that looks a little bit like Datadog, where we have an observability page for a model that's in production. We give you this centralized dashboard that is scalable for LLM applications and unifies those two chunks, the experiments piece and the production piece. So as you're iterating and developing, and then also once the model's in production. And finally, this is a platform that has defaults that we'll set up that are driven by the use cases we're seeing with customers in the field, but it's also very configurable. And so the goal here is for you to be able to customize exactly the types of charts and alerting that you'd want to see in production. So next, I'll touch on the model registry. So how are we capturing models in this system? So we have these challenges where each of the different members of the team need something slightly different. And so I'll touch on first the MLOps persona. They need a source of truth centrally for the latest, best models. And right now, if a practitioner is logging a new model, training a new model, it's really easy for that to get lost. Maybe it goes to an S3 bucket somewhere. Maybe they have like a Google Sheet with links to different models, but it's not totally clear where the very best model is. So MLOps persona needs that central source of truth. The ML exec needs to see all of the model tasks. So what are the different projects people are working on and how are they performing, right? Do we have a model for a chatbot that's in production right now? And how is it doing? Is it serving predictions well? How is it being iterated on by the team? On the compliance side, this is really critical for some of our customers who are in a space that's highly governed by a lot of compliance restrictions like banking or anything in the financial sector or healthcare sector. Being able to enforce data governance policies is really critical to be able to meaningfully use machine learning in production. So having a tool that helps enforce that will be valuable for both compliance and also the execs. On the PM side, being able to see documentation for the models, so understanding, kind of the model card of exactly what went into the model, what the caveats are, what the restrictions are, what the expected input and output shape is. And finally, the practitioner is constantly iterating, building new models, and needs to publish those very best models into a central place. And so how do we address this in the model workflow? So at a high level, and you'll recognize this pattern in your own context, you start off with experimentation, and we have this now handoff process to promote the model into the registry. Then we have the staging step. So that takes that new promoted model and tests it and makes sure that that can be consumed by, say, a team that's doing deeper evaluation or testing for different critical cases. Now, automation, that can allow the process of taking a model and deploying it to be really standardized and clean across each member of the team, so that there's a centralized action for deploying to staging to interact with the model, as well as deploying to production. And we'll also really touch on controls here. So in the context of automation and then deploying to production endpoints, we really care about who's allowed to do that. And so Hoff will touch on how we can control the access there to make sure only the right people can deploy a model to a production service. So now, what does the model registry look like? So how am I capturing this overarching workflow in a central place? First, we have the central model repository. So all of your tasks that you're doing at work are centralized in a single page. And you can dive in to see a model card for each of those tasks. So you can say, okay, give me all the details that I need to know about this chatbot that we have in production. Then we also have lineage. So say somebody's updated that we were able to capture the history of what's changed. So in this context, we're able to see, okay, there are a few different members of the team who've updated the model, and we can trace back to see where that model came from. So in the context of LLMs, this could be who has fine-tuned the model on the latest data, when did it change, what was the data set that was used to fine-tune that model, and then when was it put into production. And finally, for webhooks, we're able to make this step seamless and automated. So we know that we're able to take the task of retraining or deploying to staging or production and connect to an external system and make that action of deployment or retraining automatic. We can also do that with launch jobs. And the cool thing about launch jobs is it makes it easy to connect to the infrastructure that you're using, whether that's a cloud cluster or a machine in the office, and run workloads on that. So Hoff will talk about how you can connect to those systems to make it really easy to run automations, right? To automate parts of the system. So what are customers saying about this process? Before using this pipeline of being able to capture models centrally, it really was tough for folks to manage their models centrally. And so MCOPA highlights here, before using the model registry, I managed all of our forecast models in my head, which honestly is not that uncommon, right? It's easy to lose track of what the best models are. Another customer we're working with talks about how they're using the model registry as a source of truth and key component of their backend. A large telecom provider uses model cards and evaluation metrics in WMB to have everyone from the product management team to the engineering team on the same page. So getting into model CI/CD, this is the workflow that we're about to present. So first, the team members involved, the practitioner, the ML Ops engineer, the team leader. In the context of LLMs, this also includes people like prompt engineers who are iterating on the prompts that are being used in production. And so when I say ML practitioner, that includes that group as well. And for the model lifecycle, you've got fresh data coming in from production. You have a model to fine tune on that fresh data. And you train, evaluate, document the results, and then deploy that model to an inference server. And critically, this is a loop, right? So this goes from being deployed to production to getting fresh data. Users are interacting with your model. And then you have that data to then fine tune or iterate and retrain the model. And so in terms of tooling, we have tools for each stage of this life cycle. And critically, I think the value that Hoff is going to walk through in his demo is how each of these components connect, right? So you're not just training a model and then you have to use another system to evaluate or deploy. We make it really easy to step between each stage of this life cycle, as well as connect to external tools to do this. So I'm really excited to see your demo today, Hoff. I want to pass it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Carrie. Excited to be here presenting to everyone today. As Carrie mentioned, I'm a success machine learning engineer at Weights Biases. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to be an ML engineer at a fictional company called ReviewCo. And so we're presenting on production models here. So we're actually going to start with a sort of production endpoint and then go through the process of looking at sort of newer models that have been developed inside of W&B, using the model registry to then trigger sort of an updated version of a better performing model, hopefully as Carrie was discussing. So you can see here, so we started the demo in Postman, a very sort of production-friendly way to look at endpoints. And you can see ReviewCo has this sort of auto-suggest endpoint that we've built out where we're serving a model such that if a user starts one of our fictional reviews, the chocolate tour was excellent. If they're not finishing that, we can sort of suggest some reasonable ways to complete that. So sort of the current version of the model, rather negatively inflected, is saying, I'm not sure if it was the best, but it was, and is sort of continuing on there. So this is sort of our production model. And what we're going to do now is switch to weights and biases, where our team has been hard at work coming up with some staging candidates that we might want to consider swapping into that production endpoint. So we can see here, as Carrie was mentioning, model registry, in this case, ReviewCo, just has sort of one registered model, small, scrappy startup getting off the ground. And we can see sort of, this is really a home base for sort of all of the work that's been going on for this, review autocomplete, auto-suggest model that we've been working on. You can see we have some automations, which we'll get to in a second. We also have Slack notifications configured here. So anytime, a new candidate version of a model is coming out, that sort of goes to a Slack channel that the team can review. And there's also a description about, the various pieces of tech that's going on. So currently, I think there was a question in the chat about whether we're talking about sort of LLM Ops, MLM Ops, or sort of a mix of those. But in this particular case, we're taking a sort of off-the-shelf open source LLM OPT, which is open sourced by Meta, I think, and then using some of those parameter-efficient fine-tuning methods, LoRa specifically in this case, to create some fine-tuned versions of that, so that we can have something that's going to suggest things similar to the kinds of reviews that our users at ReviewCo have done. And then I think serving models, serving speed for LLMs is also something that's particularly top of mind for a lot of customers. And so you can see here we have sort of a staging model, and then also this staging C2 model version that we've tagged, where we sort of used this library ctranslate 2 to compress and quantize that model and sort of store that version. And so I think a lot of our customers are starting to think about how we can have automations and jobs such that if you have a staging candidate, let's do file format conversions, optimizations, and save that version in the model registry as well. So we'll come back here in a second to adjust these aliases. But first I want to talk about the automations linked here, and then go into sort of where all of this sort of run data was captured inside of W&B. So first off, you can see there's sort of two automations related to this. The first is what we're sort of going to finish this demo with. There's an automation for deploying the production model. And so our ReviewCo team has a deployment input stood up. We're seeing, some customers have sort of serverless technologies, some customers using GitHub Actions, sort of variety of flavors of ways to do a deployment loop like this. But in this case, there's that endpoint, and we have webhook support in weights and biases such that anytime someone comes in and adds an alias, specifically production, that's going to trigger this webhook to deploy the production version of that model. So we'll sort of see that happen live in the demo today. There's also a second automation using a launch job, which has been running as the team has been producing sort of new candidate models here. And so what this does is listen for the staging alias, and anytime that happens, this spins up a job to pull that model down, take sort of a larger validation sort of holdout set that isn't used for training, generate some inferences with that, and put that into one of those reports that Carrie was showing earlier, which we'll see in the demo. And the team can sort of use that to determine, should we do a go, no-go decision on putting this model into production. So those are the two automations we're going to see come to life here in a second. But first off, what's sort of happening in this W&B project? You can see here there's 90 runs. Our team's been hard at work on a lot of training jobs, using Tesla T4 GPUs, We can see, some, reasonable evaluation loss scores compared to where they might have been before. And then because this is using our Hugging Face integration, you can see here it's one of our sort of most informative integrations. So a lot of configs about all of these training runs are being saved to W&B. But sort of especially with LLMs, one of the questions we often get is, how can we make it easier for data scientists and ML engineers to access those GPUs? And so for this project, for the most part, whether we were running hyperparameter sweeps or sort of one-off training runs, we were using launch jobs. And so over here for this project, you can see there's sort of two jobs. The first is that sort of model evaluation job we were talking about, that's going to run in an automated fashion. We'll talk about that in a second. There's also this, fine-tuning job that we've created here. And you can click into here and you can see sort of all of the different runs that were triggered for this. You can also, for a launch job, you can also go through and find the specific code if you have sort of code saving enabled for a job. So we can see here where we're importing some various PyTorch and Hugging Face libraries, setting our WB entities to ReviewCo, getting the project right. And then, for our Hugging Face integrations, it's sort of a couple lines to set some environment variables to really capture a whole lot of useful information about these models. So setting one log model checkpoint, that's going to make it so that all of these jobs are saving checkpoints. So if anything would need to be preempted and resumed later, which is especially a common practice for LLM workflows, that's going to be taken for us automatically. And it's also going to make it really easy to take the final version of this model and bring it into the model registry. And then also 1B watch is going to log the gradients of the models for us as well. But from a data scientist, once that's been sort of built up, the really nice thing here is that we can now launch that directly to GPUs from the UI. So let's say you want to adjust the learning rate up here. You want to use the production version of the data set, which we'll talk about data set versioning at the end. Maybe you want to do a smaller number of training epochs. From here in the UI, we sort of have the ability to launch straight to that GPU instance that W&B is connected to. And so that's sort of one way that the ReviewCo team created these jobs. The second way was sort of using our hyperparameter sweeps functionality, which not going to go into that into the webinar today, but happy to have follow-on conversations with folks who are interested in that. So, to the question of how did all of this data get here, answer number one is sort of launching to GPUs with this particular job. Answer number two is that we also sort of were running some evaluation jobs. And so these, you can see various different runs. Anytime a staging candidate was added to the model registry, we ran this job to evaluate it and save a report. So we can click in here and see sort of what this model evaluation job is doing. So, one thing it's doing is saving some high level metrics. So it's, latency is very important. So ran some metrics to see sort of in seconds sort of response times. You can see here the quantized compressed version that we mentioned using ctranslate 2 only takes sort of 0.4 seconds for 3 reviews. The sort of unoptimized versions are taking almost 10x longer. So that's something we might want to take into consideration in terms of which model we want to put into production. Also sort of saving this table of sort of those holdout set prompts as well as responses for the various models. But to make it really easy for the team, what we actually did, and so we actually have Slack notifications for the team such that as soon as a good candidate model comes up, we're going to take that, send a Slack notification, folks can go in and view the report. I'm not yet brave enough to demo Slack live on a webinar. So we're using W&B's ability to capture logs. And so, we can see here, this job finishes and we have this URL for a report. And what's sort of really sleek and something we're starting to see a few customers do is we can actually use this report, assuming we're logged in with the right permissions, to actually trigger that webhook to update the model that's live in production right now. And so again, this is going to be a W&B report. fairly similar in structure to what, a lot of folks on this call might have been creating, by clicking around in the UI, but this was sort of all scripted using our reports API. And so you can see sort of various sections here. So just sort of a level setting overview at ReviewCo, like to make things fun. So aiming for 5 stars for the model. Fun little Easter egg you can embed Spotify and YouTube in reports. Best wishes for the staging model. So you can also include sort of, key metrics about sort of all of your training runs here. So, what's the minimum evaluation loss, training loss, sort of longest training runtime if you're really concerned about, spending lots of GPU budget. Sort of good standard W&B chart so we can keep a track of, which model, which one run was performing the best. Maybe should we maybe continue training for longer, or are we starting to asymptote here? But particularly for the candidate staging model, we can sort of see that table here, sort of make those comparisons, and also look at some sort of sample predictions here. So having worked in NLP for a while, this is perhaps one of my favorite features, is that long text spans sort of automatically pop out, and so you can sort of copy and sort of explore them in sort of a very easy, intuitive way versus working with spreadsheets, notebooks, things like that. But we can see here, this is sort of some of the sample prompts. Wish I could have gotten a haircut after spending 5. And you can see sort of the current production model is currently going off and talking about years in the industry, and is getting into this sort of loop about being in the same boat, which is maybe not sort of the highest quality output. Meanwhile, the model that we fine tune is at least realizing that haircuts are related to salons. Not particularly sure why the model thinks it wasn't allowed to have a haircut, but for auto suggesting a few of the next words, much more sort of on target. And the same thing for the compressed version of the model as well. So by sort of taking into account this additional context, we might want to go ahead and, let's say the compressed version performing 10x faster, and seemingly still having sort of pretty reasonable results. We might want to use that webhook to move that into production right now, right here. And so this is a view of the model registry inside of this report. And so what we can do is click straight into the staging candidate that was compressed, and we can add a production alias to that. And so one thing you're going to note is that production is actually sort of in a different color. And so for aliases that you're going to tie to webhooks and other automations, you're not going to want probably every member of the team to have the ability to move a model into production. So this is protected, and since I'm an admin for the model registry, I was able to add that alias, which is sort of triggering that webhook to fire. And so to sort of prove that, we can now go back to sort of our original example, and the chocolate tour was excellent. Sort of the old version of the model was saying, I'm not sure if it was the best, but it was ... And now we can see, having just changed an alias from the model registry, because we had that webhook up to our sort of endpoint that our team was using. We've now sort of swapped the live production model at this endpoint to say, but I was a little disappointed that I didn't get to see, like, probably slightly better quality, a little bit less negative. Maybe some better progress there. Though I think from looking at those example outputs, probably some more time, fine tuning models is going to really be helpful for ReviewCo there. So taking a step back. So what we sort of went through there was starting with the production model, going inside W&B, seeing what work the team had already done, and promoting a candidate model to production, and sort of getting a good loop there. But for folks that are thinking about model CI, sort of new data coming in is sort of another key aspect that we're seeing folks use. And so all the things we talked about in terms of model versioning, there's sort of similar analogs to that for data sets to sort of close that CI loop. So you can see here, for the artifacts for this project, I have sort of a variety of versions of models. There's sort of this downsampled version that has sort of less data for sort of fast, quick training runs. And there's sort of the current production version of the data set, which you can see is sort of split into train, test, valid files that was used to train that model. the really interesting thing that you can do is you can also set automations for that. And so we have an automation set here such that anytime, a new version of that reviews data set is created, that's going to launch that training job as well. So you're not going to even necessarily need the team to come in, click launch on that, the fine tuning job like we were talking about. That can just be triggered automatically by just sort of adding a new data set here. And to show what that looks like, popping here to the terminal, we can sort of run a Python, script to ingest new data from sort of a data CSV file, sort of a very common workflow where we're seeing from customers where every sort of week or two, you get sort of a new set of data. So this is going to, just add a new version of that artifact. And so popping into WB then, we can sort of refresh and see a couple things here. So the first is that we now sort of have this sort of staging latest version of that data set. And sort of the second thing you can note is that, WISE Deluge 117 just happened and is now sort of training on that staging data set. And so that happened again automatically. All we really did was add one new data set version. And now that is triggering a launch job on our GPUs just from sort of a batch data ingest. So again, sort of a lot of exciting pieces that we're seeing, folks pull together with the model registry so that you can have, automations to, coming back here to take, production models, send them to a live endpoint, or, anytime, let's say that job that we just kicked off, if it has a really good evaluation loss, we might, tag that as a new staging candidate and then have sort of a separate job to sort of evaluate that. So again, the sort of real key power here I think we're seeing from a lot of users is, from the WMB UI, you now have the ability to do sort of so much sort of production work as well as sort of eval staging work without having to jump to a different interface. So hopefully, fingers crossed, with a few more iterations, a few more batches of fresh data, ReviewCo's model can get maybe a little bit better, and that'll take them to be, the next Gen AI unicorn out there. With that, back to you, Carrie.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Hoff. That was a wonderful demo. And it feels really good having seen kind of the process of development, over the years at Weights and Biases, to see that we've gotten to this point where this entire life cycle is possible. So really appreciate walking through that with you. Andrea has just let me know that there's a good question in the chat from George, who's asking about the differences between LLM Ops versus MLOps. And so I'll take a swing at this, and then Hoff, I'd love your opinion too. So what are issues beyond fine-tuning LLMs like prompt engineering? How do we address these? So my perspective is there's a shared pattern that's fundamental between both of them, right? Where you have something that you change, you want to test it and make sure that it's better than the previous one, and then deploy it and monitor how that's performing, and then go back and iterate. So in the world of models that Hoff just described, that's going to be fine-tuning the model, deploying it. In the world of prompts, which I touched on briefly in my slides, that's iterating on the prompt, seeing results in something like the samples table, debugging things like the lang chain issues where maybe it's calling the wrong tool, or it gets the wrong answer from a tool. Or I actually have had a lot of timeouts when I'm using lang chain. So many of my bugs are just from like rate limiting. And then how do you move from there to having that prompt then used in production, monitor that, and be able to iterate on it? And so in my mind, the LLM Ops piece of this from the prompt side is really about using those two new components that we've recently come out with. So on the traces side, that's visualizing each input and output, and then on the I'll pull up an example because I think it's a little bit easier to understand this by looking at a live example. So one moment. So here on this page, I'm looking at a report visualizing the results of using LangChain to interact with a model that's trying to take an input of a math question and produce an output of the correct answer. And you can see there's actually a lot of false. There's a lot of failures here, a lot of inputs that didn't get an output at all. And there's also some ones that worked. So in this example, so I'll click in here. I can dig into the trace timeline view below. And so it's this interaction, George, when you're asking, what's the difference? Where being able to see sample executions of what happened at each step and dig into behind the scenes how, for example, the chain is being executed. This is the portion that, in my mind, is slightly different from this core workflow that Hoff just outlined. But I think fundamentally, the higher level pattern of I've changed something, I want to test it and then deploy it, is still, it matches both in the traditional ML of retraining model and in the prompt iteration sense. And so I think there's this key new tool for visualizing the results of editing the prompt and seeing how it's performing. And Hoff, I'm curious from your perspective, what's your thoughts on the difference between LLM Ops and ML Ops with WB?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. Yeah, so I definitely +1 to everything you're saying there. I think, from talking with customers, it almost feels like LLM Ops often is sort of a superset of ML Ops. To your point, that sort of general workflow that we sort of walked through for ReviewCo of, hey, we have a fresh new set of data, we want to fine tune a model, check its performance, and sort of bring that into production. That's something you could imagine holding true for, computer vision workflows, for sort of really nuanced biological models, sort of whatever type of model would exist there. There's definitely a little bit of nuance that just can get a little bit trickier with LLM space. So for example, definitely glossed over it for ReviewCo, but when you use, parameter efficient fine tuning, that's just saving the slices of sort of new parameters. And so there's a little bit of extra work you need to think through about which do you want to persist? How do you then get sort of the full model available for production? So I think, there's generally just some extra complications to LLMs that folks are working through as that tooling is evolving so quickly. So there's, I think it's the same basic workflows, but just a little more complicated because of how the LLMs are. And then to your other point, Gary, there's, some stuff that's just going to be brand new that's not really traditionally in ML Ops. So, how are you iterating on your, retrieval augmented generation? How are you thinking about few shot learning and managing those sort of data sources? Having to access, a data store like that is not something that folks typically think through when sort of training models or going to production. So, a lot of the trace tools that we built out are really, around supporting that use case and definitely new. Similarly to, iterating on sort of various prompt versions and things like that. And then, a couple of folks, especially, some customers that are doing workflows like ReviewCo, where you're, fine tuning an open source model. Sometimes they will actually incorporate sort of paid APIs as part of their eval process. So I know we have connections to OpenAI evals. Other folks are just sort of using a really high powerful model to provide some extra feedback of, which of these 3 candidate models is producing the best answer. And so I think, again, LLM Ops just feels like a really additive superset of there's so many extra workflows you can now do, and also your base workflows. Again, the process is going to be the same as CV and in other spaces, but given how fast the tooling is changing, sort of, very, very tricky to get it right.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Hoff. And Andrea is highlighting another question from the chat from Ganesh. Could you give an example on multimodal data, like tabular plus text data? So I did pull one up that I'm familiar with from our work here. And this is showing what it looks like inside Weights and Biases to interact with image models and then text to image synthesis. And so going from like a text prompt to the results. And maybe there are different types of results from different types of models. And so the nice thing here is if you have a few different models that are tested on the same text input, you can actually compare them in this same central view. And here in this page that I'm displaying, this is actually blog post that we posted publicly, and I'll share the link as well. But the actual page that I'm loading is a report in WB. And the nice thing about that is you could literally create this internally for your team. So you could say like, here's some text input that I tried that generated these images, or here's some images that we input and they generated, like the model generated these captions. And here's some very good examples. It's really good at describing landscape scenes, perhaps, but it actually has a really hard time with scenes with a lot of people. And so maybe we can analyze what's going on there. We can talk about the findings and debug, and you can describe that all in a report like this. So I could come in here and update and edit both the visualizations, so these text and image tables, as well as the descriptive narrative around them. So explaining to my team, what's happening in my research and then what the right next steps are. So this is one example that immediately came to mind when you were asking about multimodal data. Hoff, do you have a perspective? Are there any sort of custom things that's good to know about in weights and biases for multimodal data?
Yeah, so I think keeping your sort of screen up right there, I think sort of that table, which for the demo earlier was sort of all text, but the fact that you can have sort of text next to sort of different layers, different segmentation inputs, sort of different text samples, sort of a really valuable way that a lot of customers that I've been working with are able to make sense of multimodal data. Because I think a key challenge is often, there's some tooling built out for images or audio or video, and then there's sort of nothing, equivalent or maybe something entirely separate for sort of the textual piece. And so there's no sort of unified place to bring that together. And so given, the ability to bring that into tables, sort of render those images live, and then, there's the ability to sort of filter, group by, and have all of those things update. So if you want to, filter off of, a keyword in the text, and then group by something else, and then look at an array of images and sort of hop through those quickly. You can do that by logging a table to WNB and then looking at it in a workspace or bringing it into reports like this that we shared. And so I think having one central place to look at both modes of data together when you're figuring out where the model is performing well or not as well is sort of a key benefit from tables that we've seen.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. Yeah, thank you, Hoff. So then I know Andrea surfaced Hi's question around RLHF and shared a couple links there. Are there any other questions in the chat that we could cover here? I feel like this has been a real whirlwind of touching on basically every component in the WB lifecycle. So I recognize this is a lot of content, and yeah, really appreciate getting to share this with folks. As a next step for being able to make this useful for your team, I think in my mind maybe the easiest place to start, and I'll pull up that slide of kind of the diagram of the model lifecycle. If you're thinking, okay, I watched this webinar, what do I do next? In my mind, you really start with this piece of either iterating on a prompt or fine-tuning, and then move on to this larger life cycle that Hoff was outlining of evaluating the performance and then documenting and deploying the model. And so when you start with that, tweaking the prompts and iterating, we do have a couple of different tools to make that easy. And so if you're looking for a good place to start, my suggestion is, in the docs, we've got this quick start for just quickly being able to track models' performance. We have the model registry, so that's organizing your models centrally. And then we also touched on prompts here. So if you're working with LLMs, this is the key suite of tools for tracing and visualizing those results. And so if you're looking for the next place to get started, what I'd love to leave you with is, these tools are open to try out, and we really want to hear from you and help you get set up. So if you have any questions about applying this to your workflow, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. And really appreciate just getting to share, each of these components with you. Oh, and I see a couple more questions have just come in. So I'll touch on these before we end. So let's see. I see one about the WMB roadmap. So in terms of the core vision for WMB, we started with experiment tracking. We expanded to this workflow of making it easier to iterate on data sets, on models, on prompts. And a critical theme for us moving forward is both the enterprise, so addressing things like broadening our integrations with other external tools, making it easier to control the workflow so it's even more clear who is taking what step along this lifecycle. And then we're also really focused around LLM tooling. So things like the production monitoring that I showed you that private preview of. In terms of where our roadmap is going, we see that there's this shift from ML practitioners being someone who has a PhD in machine learning to people who are working on and building models and iterating on prompts being a much larger set of folks with different backgrounds. So that includes folks who are doing prompt engineering who maybe are coming from a software engineering background and are really interested in getting a model to be useful in production by tweaking the prompts, as well as fine-tuning and these other pieces we touched on. So that's why it seems so opportune for us at Weights and Biases to be able to go from this point of experiment tracking to covering the larger life cycle of how you get a good model to then put into production and be useful for your team. So key focuses on production monitoring and LLMs, and then enterprise controls and making it really easy to productionize your model. So then I see Samit has a question. Is there a report for retraining models for the use case Matt discussed of having new data every 2 weeks? So Hoff, I'll pass that to you. Is there any guide around automatic retraining on new data?
So we might be creating one coming out of this workshop. So I think there's nothing available yet to share, but I think as a follow-up, we can sort of link. I mean, again, it's using the building blocks that we sort of talked about before. So automation. So anytime there's a change to that sort of source data set, and then sort of having that launch job that's going to sort of retrain. And I think there's sort of a best practice there that we've started to see where you can actually in your WMB config have a parameter for the alias for the data set version that you want to do, which is sort of letting me in the example, swap from sort of the downsampled version to a production version and then use a staging version whenever we're doing the retraining. So mostly sort of using standard pieces there are docs for, but given that there's interest, might sort of write up something focused specifically on that.
Perfect. And totally agree, Hoff. I think that this workflow is a perfect addition after this webinar to create this. So Andrea, I'd love your help following up with Samit after this event to share what we create.
Yes. I see a very specific question from Carlos I could take care of. Yeah.
Go for it.
So question was in sort of around whether artifact caching was smart. And so whether if only, a few labels had changed, is there like a new artifact or sort of how does that work? So specifically for the demo that we had there, those sort of train, test, and valid splits actually contain sort of individual Parquet files. And so the way that I was sort of doing batch ingest, which is similar to what I've seen a few customers do as well, is using one of our capabilities called incremental artifacts. And so all that's doing is sort of incrementally adding in sort of new, in this case, I was doing sort of timestamped, for here's, the batch of data at this particular time that's being added incrementally to the train data. And then whenever the sort of training job kicks off, that just sort of aggregates all of that data at once. So especially for folks that, have sort of a stream, sort of using the ability in artifacts to, have folders separating things and then just incrementally adding files is a pattern that we've seen before there.
Perfect. Thank you, Hoff. And I see one more question from Gordon, who wants to know, do we have an example of how a user can provide feedback to the results of an LLM? And Gordon, this is a fantastic question. Back to the roadmap conversation. This is actually exactly what what we've been discussing here is how to make it really easy to take the columns that you've logged and then add a custom column. And so we don't have a report for this, but I think this is another good report that we could create as a quick follow-up here. And the pattern for doing this is using just the standard API that we have already, wb.log. And so you can customize what columns are visible in that table I was showing you. And that makes it possible for you to have your own evaluation criteria, as well as the defaults that I was showing. So Andrea, I'm taking a note to follow up with Gordon as well, as well as Samit to talk about those 2 additional reports from this discussion. Awesome. Looks like that's all of the questions we have here today. I really appreciate getting to share these workflows with you, and I really hope that you'll give it a try for tracking your own process here. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We're really excited to help people use this process in your own teams. And Hoff, thanks for an awesome demo. Cool. Have a good one, everyone.
Cheers all.
Cheers.